looking at the local dynamics and how they're playing into the unit, it seems to be no seemingly obvious pressure on the rand this morning. It's back below 770, and of course the big focus this week is on the MPC decision on Thursday and the tone of the MPC statement, largely expected to keep the repo rate on hold at 5.5% for the 8th successive meeting. But what kind of rhetoric are we likely to hear from Marcus with regarding the interest rate outlook for 2012?
Well, I mean, I think the rhetoric that would come from the Reserve Bank governor is what everyone is looking forward to. So recent comments that she's made have suggested that the bank's stance on inflation is starting to shift, whereas previously they talked quite a bit about inflationary pressures as being cost push in nature. Now we're hearing talk that they see these pressures as being more, more generalized, and we've also seen quite a sharp uptick in household consumption expenditure in the final quarter of last year. So of course that will certainly be key when it comes to this week's statement and the post-meeting press briefings. That everyone will be wanting to know whether the bank's view has in fact changed. As far as where we stand on this, the most recent developments on the inflation front we think have been largely positive, and I'm counting the Eskom reduced electricity tariff hike in there as being one of the main factors. So we still see inflation peaking at about 6.3%, but we see that the potential for it to come back into target range earlier than expected has certainly risen. So we've maintained our view that rates are not likely to change this year. In fact, we've been saying that for some time, and we only see the first change in rates coming through next year. So as far as where we stand, we think that the market at the moment is a little bit too bearish on rates, and we think that the potential for a rate hike is very slim indeed.
Just reiterating your view on where inflation will peak, looking at 6.3%. We have had some commentary from the likes of Nomvuyo saying that they see inflation as having peaked and now coming down to 6.1% was the latest number.
I'm not in line with the view that it's already peaked. Remember that there's still quite a few price increases that have to come through, for instance, that were announced in the budget. Also a number of very steep petrol price increases that also have to come through into the inflation number. So we'd certainly maintain our view that inflation is still going to peak, although probably not at a very much higher level than we have at the moment. So we see the peak at being 6.3%, and that would be in the second quarter of this year, and then should steadily decline and could be back within target range as early as Q3 this year.
What are your views on how the rand is likely to trade ahead of the MPC announcement? Because we have seen the rand, of course, spike. It has now stabilized below 770. What type of bias are we looking at on the local currency?
Well, I think the rand is likely to maintain a weakening bias this week. It certainly does seem that the market mood is rather jittery at the moment. We had a very bad PMI print, advanced PMI print out of China and both Europe. So I don't think that those jitters have been dispelled at all. And of course, attention never strays very far away from the Eurozone. So I think all things said, the rand is likely to be largely on the back foot this week, but probably quite range bound ahead of the MPC announcement on Thursday.
Then let's focus in on Eurozone developments this week. Of course, we've got Spanish and Italian bond auctions midweek, and that will be a signal of the confidence that the investment community has in the stability of those two key economies, peripheral countries, that being said. And of course, we've also got some comments from Merkel to look out for, the ECB President Draghi. What are your thoughts on the likely trade we'll see on the euro dollar given these key events in the market?
Well, certainly those events that you've mentioned are going to be key risk factors. But when it comes to the euro dollar, it's quite interesting that that currency pair has been stuck in quite a narrow range, and largely because we haven't seen the dollar make the kind of moves or advances. Despite the good economic data, it hasn't strengthened as far as one might have expected. And that's because, all said, it does look like levels of currency volatility and risk aversion remain quite low, and we'd know that the dollar does tend to strengthen primarily in times of global crisis. So certainly what happens this week with the bond auctions and comments by Angela Merkel and President Draghi are certainly going to be key for that. But it's going to be quite tough to get the euro dollar to break out of this quite narrow range that it's been stuck in.
On Friday, we've got Eurozone finance ministers meeting, and there's possible talk of them boosting the bailout fund. And if they manage to boost it beyond 1 trillion euros, that will be a catalyst for the IMF then also coming in and boosting reserves further. What does this mean for the euro dollar if we do have an announcement of an increased bailout fund in Europe?
Well, certainly if events pan out in the way that you've just sketched them now, we'd expect to see the euro certainly strengthen on the back of that. That would certainly be something that markets are looking forward to. Of course, as I mentioned, concerns about the eurozone have, even when not necessarily reflected in the currency, haven't really tended to go away over the past 3 years, and as the crisis has limped on and on. So certainly some movements that would suggest that the crisis is coming to an end or moving towards some positive conclusion, such as the one that you suggested, would certainly be positive for both the euro and I think sentiment in risky assets across the board.